Okay, so before we get started, thank you for grabbing resources on your way in. I just want to provide one more as a door prize. So how many people do we have registering? I'm doing that right now. Okay, so
I'm mixing up the numbers so they pick a number.
So while she's doing that, raise your hand if this is your first time pruning. Grapes, I should say. Okay. No, pruning grapes, period. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so hopefully this will span the knowledge between those who have been pruning for, even if it's 1 to 2 years, or those who have been pruning for 10 to 20 years, and then those who have never pruned before. This is going to be a relatively broad-based presentation, so if you have more specific questions to your operation, then please feel free to use our demo time after the presentation to discuss that, or out in the vineyard when we go out to do hands-on demo. I should also ask, who brought pruning shears with them? Great, okay. So we might have to share a little bit, but we have how many pairs ourselves?
I only brought mine. I mean, I can stop back with them.
Okay, so we'll do a lot of sharing or watching or viewing or partnership with our pruning out in the field.
30. Have to pick a number between 1 and 30.
32.
30.
All right, Randy, because you brought the bull cane, pick a number between 1 and 32.
How about 17?
17, okay. Who's number 17, Diane?
Laura Schmitz.
Laura Schmitz. Do you have a copy of the 2023 and 2024 Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide?
I don't think so.
You do now. Congratulations. Perfect. For all your pesticide needs.
Should take business cards.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Click in the PowerPoint. Okay, so again, I'm Maria, she's Diane. We have a third technician named Fernanda Cahoon who is in Brazil right now with a lot warmer weather than what we have. And we are the current HCS viticulture program in horticulture and crop science with OSU. I provided some promo copies of the Midwest Grape Production Guide if you came in and we're one of the first, 20 people or so, but you can still get a copy of these. It's Bulletin 919 through the OSU Extension Office. We will have a second edition that will be coming out sometime in the next year or so. I'm currently working with OSU Publishing to finish up that revision. And then if you haven't visited our website, it is go.osu.edu/grapes, where you can find a lot of the resources from our program there. And then Diane also asked if you have not been added to our OGen, Ohio Grape Electronic Newsletter listserv. That is where we put out all of our announcements on upcoming events and new resources that are available. So for today, we do have an agenda. We have a lecture component and then 2 hands-on activities. The lecture is going to cover the what, why, and when of dormant pruning for grapes specifically, some common pruning mistakes, and then I wanted to discuss a little bit about our winter injury polar vortex from January and how, if you do happen to have bud injury, how you would adjust to retain additional buds to compensate for that injury. And then our 2 hands-on activities are going to be a bud dissection demo. We have 2 stations set up there on both sides of the table that you can use to dissect various canes from different grape species. And then we are also, after that, then going to go out to Hort Unit 2 for our pruning, hands-on pruning demo. So if you've never pruned a vine before, we're actually ripping these vines out this year, so if you butcher them to death, it doesn't matter. But honestly, we want you to learn what those pruning mistakes are and how to make them so that you can avoid them in the future. Okay, so a little bit about what dormant pruning is, and this is a vine taken from January at Chardonnay. It is the annual removal of 1 or 1+ year old wood during the dormant period. So grapes do have a perennial growing cycle. They go dormant as wood in the winter and then reemerge as green herbaceous tissue in the spring. And on this vine, you'll see like, oh wow, this has not been pruned. So what I did is I went ahead and I already took 90% off on this side of the vine here, and this is what your vine typically should look like after pruning. So vines are very distinct from trees in that respect. You would never remove 90% of a tree, and I think for ornamentals at least, it's 30% is the maximum that you would remove in any given year. But for vines, we're looking at 90+% of the wood removed. Hey, Paul. During our dormant pruning cycle. So this is what that perennial cycle happens to look like, dormant pruning through harvest and all the steps and when you should do them. Granted, canopy management of any kind is going to be dependent on way more things, but is heavily dependent on dormant pruning itself, which takes place between January and March. We do want to let our vines go fully dormant before we start pruning, so we don't want to start prematurely pruning in like October, November timeframe. Okay. So there are 3 reasons why we perform dormant pruning, and in grapes in particular, it's to regulate yield or to avoid overcropping, because we know there is a strong relationship between the amount of fruit that our vines produce and the vegetative growth of that vine. And again, when I mentioned canopy management has everything to do with how you manage your vineyard in general. That could be fertilization and nutrient inputs. That could be pest management. It's all going to influence the vegetative vigor of that vine, but so will the amount of cropping. The second reason is to balance the vegetative and fruit growth. We want those shoots to be a minimum of 2 to 3 feet in length so that we have enough leaf area to actually be able to fully ripen that fruit, but also for that vine to perform all of its functions throughout the growing season, whether that's defense and being able to fend off pests and diseases, whether that's to reacclimate. Like the reason why I put this figure up is because we want our vines to be pretty and yellow all the way through the fall, because that's the time that it's reabsorbing all those nutrients that those leaves are then photosynthesizing and producing as both stored carbon, but also stored nutrients in the form of nitrogen, potassium, and micronutrients. And then the third reason why we prune, and this is really important to vines in particular, is to maintain the shape consistent with the training system. So if it were a tree, it's got an architecture unto itself and a growth habit unto itself, and grapes have a growth habit as well, but we use trellises as a means to train those vines to keep a consistent shape and to have a consistent uniform canopy with regards to where the fruit is positioned, but also to how that foliage grows. So I guess I don't have a door prize for it, but what is the name of this training system? Anybody know?
Top wire cord.
Yeah, that's almost cheat mode because Randy's been growing grapes for a while. But yeah, we do call this a high wire training system. And we'll get into there in a minute. And so this is why regulating yield is so important, is because it maximizes fruit quality. And at the end of the day, when it comes to table grapes or wine grapes, that is our ultimate goal. It is quality first, quantity second. And quantity is obviously important because that's what pays the bills. And there are ways to do that. But it's a maximization game. It's an optimization game. It's not a how much yield can we push out because we're selling Concord to Welch's for $300 a ton. It's a how high of a quality product can I get to go into that value added bottle of wine, or how ripe can I get that table grape so that my customer will be happy coming to pick it up. So it's a quality first product. Regulating your yield gets you there. So this is an example of Cabernet Franc and what we call best viticulture practices. So whether that be dormant pruning and making sure we're adjusting our bud numbers correctly for the number of shoots, whether that's shoot positioning to maximize that canopy spread and light interception, whether that's leaf removal to expose those clusters to sunlight, cluster thinning to once again fine tune the regulation of that yield, or what have you. That's what leads to this really great dark color fruit, in contrast to shaded, overcropped, too many clusters on that vine, Cabernet Franc, which is a paler red. It's going to be a less ripe, less quality product, because now you're not going to have the same dark color, you're not going to have the same mouthfeel, you're not going to have the same sugar accumulation and fermentation rates, and importantly, you're going to have in Cabernet Franc what's called methoxypyrazine or bell pepper that's going to contribute to a very herbaceous quality of that fruit and of that wine. So being able to regulate that yield gives you the best possible outcome, or is the first step in getting to that best possible outcome in the fruit quality. Okay, and again, to reiterate, balanced vines or healthy vines, this is what we want our canopy to look like, and this is points for naming this training trellis system. Yep, vertical shoot position. Balanced vines are healthy vines. We want our canopies to look like this, where we have nice vegetative growth. It's properly distributed. We have a fruiting zone that is very uniform, and clusters that are exposed to sunlight and ripening well. But what you'll notice is there's not too many shoots in this picture. So having this balanced vine allows us to get this level of canopy growth and vegetative growth to be able to sufficiently and properly ripen that fruit, because everything's about what we call source-sink relationships. How much source or leaves do you have to produce that photosynthate that then moves down into your sink, which is the fruit, and where ultimately everything is accumulating during that ripening period. The second and very important for us, second and third and important for us, is developing healthy wood. Sun-exposed wood is healthy wood. Without sun exposure, we end up with weaker wood that's going to be more susceptible to cold injury, and that is not what we want living in the state of Ohio. And so towards that, we can attain our maximum cold hardiness. So for instance, when we hit -10 Fahrenheit in Wooster back in January, we want our buds and we want our vines that are more sensitive to be able to withstand those temperatures and not damage those sensitive primary buds. The way to do that is through sunlight exposure. So a balanced canopy helps us achieve that. Okay. And then lastly, conforming the vines to the training system. We already went over this a little bit with the examples, but this is what it looks like both schematically with a vertical shoot position vine. Typically this permanent arm in a cordon spur prune system is going to be at around 2.5 to 3 feet in height, or around 30 to 36 inches. And then the shoots grow upward. So one thing that I want you to notice is these spurs here are pointing this way because the shoots want to grow upwards this direction. And this is what it looks like out in the vineyard itself. Again, focusing on where that fruiting zone is right here, and all the vegetative growth going upwards. The second type is the high wire cordon system. And I say cordon because this is a permanent arm of the vine here. But what I want you to notice is the fruiting zone is going to be a little bit lower. And that by high, I mean, this is typically 5.5 to 6 feet in canopy height, where that fruiting wire is going to be going. And then the fruit zone is going to be right here, which this is a slightly blown in picture. So fruiting zone goes underneath that wire, not above it. And then the shoots grow downwards. So what you'll notice in this schematic is that the spurs then are also pointing downwards, because that's the direction you want that shoot to grow. There are a lot more training systems than just this. These are what we call single curtain systems, where you only have one layer of vegetation in either direction, either up or down. We have vertically divided systems called Smart Dyson or Scott Henry that can also divide your canopies along both vertical planes. And then we have horizontally divided systems like Geneva double curtain system, which will horizontally divide, and you have about a foot in between each, and a curtain that goes directionally downwards from there. So there are a lot more training systems out there. These are just the two that are most common to Ohio vineyards, and typically what we're going to recommend for either table or wine grapes, unless you have exceptions to that by either virtue of that vegetative growth of that vine or some other need in terms of how you want to distribute or how many buds and yield capacity that vine can handle. Okay, so yeah, there's my animation. Okay, so here's that winter pruned Chardonnay up close. This is what these 90% removed actually looks like. So when a lot of folks start initially pruning grapes, the biggest thing that I come across is that there are just simply too many buds. And how many buds would you guess are actually here?
12 or so, 12, 14.
Close.
16.
Close. There's actually 18 buds that are retained on this. So our goal for this vine was to retain 36 total buds per vine, because this vine is 6 foot spaced. So divide that by 2. This one arm alone has about 18 buds, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spurs. Is that math correct? I am not known for my arithmetic, just to be completely fair, and anybody who's known me for longer than 10 minutes knows that. So, yeah, so there should be around 18 buds on this cordon that have been pruned down. And the way that you can tell is each bud is actually gonna be along this 1-year-old piece of wood. These 1-year-old pieces of wood or spurs are what we actually use as our renewal and fruiting positions for the following year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth. So on a VSP system, just as a reminder, you'll notice all these spurs, they're pointing upwards. And again, that's intentional because it takes advantage of the growth habit of this Chardonnay vine, where those shoots need to grow vertically and upwards. So in contrast, this is a Petite Pearl. Right here, it's a hybrid on a high wire cordon. And how many buds would you guess are on this vine total? This has already been pre-pruned.
32.
Close, but nope,
48.
too many. There's 42. There are 42 vines, 42 buds on this vine, and the difference here is that each one of these spurs contains 3 to 4 buds. So that's the big difference. But again, the primary reason why, I mean, it's fun to guess, but the other reason why is that I just wanted to demonstrate to you on this high wire cordon, all the spurs are positioned either down or out. They are not positioned upwards, and it's because of the directional growth that we want these vines to have to take advantage of what hybrids tend to do, which is a cascading downward facing growth habit. So the reason why we pick 5.5 or 6 feet is purely because we don't want to be hedging these vines every single day during the summer. That would take a gross amount of time. That said, I'm only 5'6", so on a 6-foot canopy, I struggle a little bit with I'm gonna build up those shoulder blade pull-up muscles a little bit, but you'll be up there doing all of your canopy management above your head if you're on the shorter end like myself. Okay. So once again, the training system is determined by growth habit as well as the vine vigor potential, and that's why I brought up earlier why we can have divided canopy systems. So the higher the vine the faster the rate of growth, the higher amount of vegetation these vines want to produce, the more we need to equally distribute that growth over the type of training system that we have. But that said, the training system that you have also determines the style in which you prune. And there are really 4 main types of pruning styles. And in Ohio, we typically only use 2 of those. So if you go out to California and you see this little goblet system where you have a vine right here, but all the shoots kind of grow out like a little mini firework, that's a head trained system, but it's not managed the same way that you would in a conventional head and cane prune system. So that's a different style of pruning, but it is one of our 4 typical pruning styles. So the 2 that are most common for us, and I've kind of already alluded to them, is called the cordon spur system. You have a permanent trunk here of the vine, but then we also have permanent arms. And those arms by permanence is not forever. It's typically between about 5 to 10 years or whenever you feel is most appropriate for your system and your vineyard management to replace. So you do have to periodically, what you call cane prune, lay down a new 1-year-old piece of wood to replace this cordon. But that is effectively what a cordon is it's the permanent arm of the vine. And then the crown or the head region is where the replacement all should emanate from. And then what we have on that cordon is called the spur. And this is that new piece of wood where all of our new growth will originate from for the next growing year cycle. That's in contrast to cane pruning, which is you are replacing this fruiting unit once every single year. So you'll take off all that upwards facing growth in this system, and you will replace it with 1 uniform new arm every single year. And that's called the cane. But on that cane system, you have to have a replacement spur. Otherwise, where else is that shoot going to grow to replace that cane? So that's the distinct difference. You don't necessarily have to maintain a renewal position on a cordon spur system, but you do have to on a cane and head prune system. So just keep that in mind. And we'll go over the advantages and disadvantages in a minute, but I wanted to show you what that looks like in real life. We don't do a ton of cane pruning in Ohio unless some of the vineyards up in Ashtabula do use cane pruning. Some of them are starting to convert back to cordon spur just for mechanization and labor capacity. But it is a method they've been using, and they use actually quadrilateral canes, so they'll lay down 4 new canes instead of 2 new canes. But traditionally, it is called bilateral because you only have 2 canes that are going bidirectionally, if that makes sense. So this is an example of a cane prune system. Here's the head of the vine. This is called a kicker cane. It can help with spring frost avoidance or tolerance, where you can lay down extra buds if you really need them. But ultimately, this cane will get cut back to 2 buds as your renewal position. And then from that, you'll get 2 new shoots that grow each year to replace these canes. But this is what it looks like laid down. So it looks really bare. And it's honestly kind of scary when you prune, because you're like, oh, nothing's ever going to grow again. And then next thing you know, you've got like 100 shoots and you don't know what to do with them all. But this is what it looks like up close in the head region. So again, this cane will get cut back to 2 buds. That's your renewal spur. And then this is where all your new growth originates from. One really important thing, and we'll reiterate it out at the Hort Farm later this afternoon, but what you'll notice is these canes all originate from underneath the fruiting wire. That's really, really important to maintaining that uniform fruiting zone. We don't want massive arches. This is not McDonald's. We don't want massive arches that then distribute our fruit up here and then down here, up here and down here. And in part, that's because we want to have consistent canopy management throughout the season, and we want to have our sprayer be as optimal in performance as possible when you're in the early season and you're trying to hit that new growth, and when you're later in the season trying to hit that fruit zone. So ideally, and it doesn't always happen, so I sympathize greatly, but ideally that new growth and replacement for either your cordon or canes will always originate from underneath the wire, arching this way instead of going above and beyond that fruiting wire. Okay, so there are some advantages to cane pruning, and I'm never going to be here to tell you you have to do things one way, because really vineyard management is going to be unique and individual to every vineyard situation and to every vine in a lot of cases. So if you do choose to do cane pruning, typically it's for a couple of reasons, and it's 1, you don't have basal buds that are fruitful. And then 2, you have high density vines, and by high density, I mean less than 5 foot between your vine spacing. That's going to necessitate that you replace those canes every year as a means of just keeping control over that vine vegetative growth. There are a couple of things though that to me are, pros or cons, and it's going to depend on also your labor availability. So if you have a lot of labor that's looking for work in the winter, man, cane prune to your heart's content, because it takes a lot of time to cut, select, and tie down those canes to renew them every single year. So really, it's shifting your labor demand to the winter season versus having that labor demand be more towards the summer. And then also the other advantage, I think, is really reducing permanent wood lowers disease inoculum. So if you're a vineyard that is very prone to phomopsis or anthracnose or other diseases that like to overwinter in the crevices of old wood, then cane pruning can help that by replacing that older wood with new wood every single year and reducing the total amount of old wood that you happen to have. That said, I would not generally recommend cane pruning for hybrid vines in case that's a concern of yours or you're thinking of adopting it, purely because hybrid vines tend to have a lot of vigor, and that vigor is better managed through cordon spur pruning than it is cane pruning. So I should put that caveat in there. So to me, the main disadvantage of cane pruning is it's very expensive. It takes a lot of labor to cut those canes, pull that brush, and then tie down a new cane each and every year. So in the case of Patty Skinkis, who's a great viticulturist out at Oregon State, she did the math on this because, again, I'm bad at arithmetic, but she found that in cane versus spur pruning, it took about 41 hours per acre or $615 per acre to cane prune a Pinot Noir vineyard versus cordon spur pruning, which only took 26 hours per acre or about $390 per acre of labor to perform. So you can get a lot of cost savings by spur pruning. And then you can make it more efficient too if you happen to mechanize your vineyard operations because you're larger than say 10 to 20 acres in scale. You can actually use pre-pruners to do a lot of that brush pulling for you using rotary tractor mounted pruners. So you can actually decrease this even more if you're not hand pruning. Again, it shifts labor demands to winter. And then the other thing for me, and this is not necessarily the end of the world, but isn't great either, is that you do tend to get a lot less uniform bud break and shoot development in cane pruning. And we'll talk about it again in a bit when it comes to using this principle of apical dominance for things like frost protection, because you can use dormant pruning to protect your vineyard from frost. But part and parcel to that means that you're not going to get every bud to break at the same time in a spur prune system, the same way that you would in a cane prune system, the same way that you would in a cordon spur prune system. So what I mean by shifting labor demands, when you cane prune, this is what it looks like in the early part of the growing season. Again, it looks really scary because you don't think these buds are going to break, but then you remember that they do. And so this is what it looks like. These shoots are about 3 to 5 inches in growth right here. But because you don't have the congestion of latent buds on older wood that are going to break sometimes, not always, it can mean that you do less shoot thinning during the actual growing season. Now, it doesn't mean you do none, because a lot of these shoots like this buds, I should say, will produce more than one shoot because grapes have compound buds. So this is, again, a divergence from trees. Grapes have 3 buds in one, and you'll see it in the dissection demo in a bit. But part and parcel to that means that these secondary and tertiary buds can also break, and we do want to remove those. So it doesn't mean no shoot thinning, it just means less. So contrast that to this cordon spur pruning system. Again, the older permanent arm is called the cordon. These little chunks of wood right here are called the spur. And there are a lot of advantages to spur pruning that are basically going to contrast to the way that you would cane prune. It is comparatively easy, right? I can take a chainsaw and just run it down the vineyard and take off all that 1-year-old wood just down to the area that I am most interested in. And so it is easy. You're not having to be as selective until you get into final hand pruning, and therefore less expensive. Cordons, again, mostly productive on lower density spacing. So when you're 5 foot and greater between your vines down the row, that's where cordon spur pruning is great. And that's because if you're cane pruning a very long cane, it is not a guarantee. In fact, it's very rare that every single bud along that cane is actually going to push. You're going to end up with a lot of blank nodes, a lot of blank spaces, and therefore blank spaces within your canopy and fruit production by virtue of having very long canes. So if you're low density, which hybrids tend to be as well, we typically space our hybrids anywhere between 6 to 8 feet between vines. Spur pruning, cordon spur pruning is a way better system for you than cane pruning. Again, mechanizable, and we can use the principles of apical dominance for delayed and double pruning in ways that we cannot with cane pruning, because if we tried to wait as long as humanly possible to prune those canes and then lay down the cane, I guarantee you'd break off like half of those buds that are along that cane once it starts breaking. And then when we have winter injury events like in January, if you actually experience significant damage, you can use spur cordon pruning to your advantage to leave more buds. And I think that's a big one when you're growing very sensitive cultivars. Again, disadvantages are that you do get overwintering inoculum from Phomopsis and Anthracnose. The way that you combat that, if I'm going to be honest, is you just more frequently replace that cordon. So instead of waiting till that cordon is like 6 inches in diameter, gnarly, tangled up around the wire, and then just diseased, old, and unproductive, you replace it once every 5 years or so and get that renewal position in place so that you have newer, fresher wood that you can reduce that disease inoculum for. You can also use products like sulfurix as dormant applications to the old wood to help knock down that inoculum as well if you had a bad Phomopsis or Anthracnose year. Again, it does shift your labor demands, but this time to the growing season because it does demand more in shoot thinning. And then once again, old cordons do lose productivity over time for a number of reasons, whether that be cold injury, just it doesn't want to pump any new suckers from the base of the cordon, or we can end up with trunk disease because you end up making more cuts along that plane. So this is what I mean by more shoot thinning. This is actually a pretty solid solidly pruned vine, so I'm not going to knock the pruning at all. Whether Diane did this or I did this, I don't actually remember, but what you'll notice is you're not going to hit every bud that you want to hit when it comes to pruning, because there are instances like this where you have a lower piece of wood here. Yeah, it was going a weird direction, which is why we cut it back, but there was still a bud right at the base of that spur right here that's pushing. So we'd have to shoot thin this off. These spurs are actually too close together in my opinion. So we would probably lop one of those off so that we have better spacing between our spurs. And as a result, it just requires a little bit more diligence and cleanup during the growing season itself, versus something like cane pruning where you have pretty much a uniform, every bud is positioned 4 to 6 inches between itself, and it kind of automatically thins for us.
So Maria, you'll go out there like in June and make sure there's still 36, and yet there's 40, you'll knock them off.
Yep. Yeah, the other thing with shoot thinning is in order to do it in a way that makes sense, you need to hit these shoots before they're 12 inches in length, because the older these shoots get, the more woody they get around the base and the harder they are to remove. So yeah, if you're talking about a high wire hybrid, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna estimate around 42 shoots per vine, final. And whether that means we're just knocking stuff off, I mean, the easier way to think about it is I have 1 foot of space and I want about six shoots in between. And I want them to be as well distributed as I can within that foot. So yes, and if you look at this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shoots within a foot of space, right? So we have to go and select 4 to knock off. And there are ways that you can do that, right? Whether they're fruitless and vegetative, I would knock those off, whether they're poor position. So like if I had a shoot that was growing downwards off of this, this vertical shoot position vine, I'd have knocked that off. Like there are ways that you can select around that, and you'll do the same too when you're pruning as well, right? If I have a spur position on a high wire that's going up, well, I'm not going to prioritize that to keep unless I absolutely need the position. So there are ways to prioritize what you do and do not choose to actually shoot thin and prune off. Okay. So this is a good example of a spur. Again, where is the actual spur on this? It's right there at the top. And this is something that like we try to avoid, but can be also a con of spur pruning, is this principle called spur stacking, right? If I'm having to cut to a 1-year-old piece of wood each and every single year, well, that means that I go year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And I should also mention, as part and parcel to that, is that vines are alternate position buds. So that spur direction can change positions on a year-to-year basis, depending on which way that shoot was growing. But this is called spur stacking. It's not great because again, it shifts the zone of where our actual fruit production is going to be on this vine, which again decreases our uniformity. So what what we should do next year is we should look for a new shoot that's going to grow closer to that cordon to elect to retain, even if we don't crop it, right? Just to have the position there and available to renew that spur in the coming year. So there are reasons why, even though you would think, okay, I'm going to remove anything that happens to grow down here, I would actually elect to keep one just so that I could renew that spur position. So that's something to keep a thought about when you're talking about cordon spur pruning. But in general, again, we should have one to two spurs, no more, per position that we're using to crop from each and every year. If we have clusters of spurs that are emanating from one position, we need to rethink our strategy for where these shoots are growing from. So again, we want like little soldiers in a row worth of shoots. We don't want clumps and little fireworks coming out of any one position where you're going to have 5 or 6 shoots per position.
Maria, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, hey, this is Eric. How you doing?
I'm good.
Hey,
How are you, Eric?
I have a question for you. So I have this picture you've got up. I've got tons of those.
Uh-huh.
And it's very annoying because, as you said, the fruiting zone is getting too high. Is there anything you can do? I think the answer is no, but is there anything you can do to shorten that spur?
Not without a renewal position.
Mm-hmm.
Or option 2, if it's really out of control, I would probably elect to replace my entire cordon.
Yeah, okay. And how do you get that little green arrow that you said is a replacement spur? How do you
Late,
know where that is going to come out?
you
Uh,
don't.
yeah,
It's you gotta kind of cross your fingers and hope for a latent bud to break. A latent bud is
yeah.
any bud that's on wood that's 2+ years old. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't.
Right.
But even if it was like within a couple of inches of proximity from the spur, I'd still take it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
honestly, if you've got, and we'll cover that too. If you got big gaps in an old cordon, just replace the cordon. You're gonna make a massive cut, and you got to be careful about how and when you do it. But that's basically what I would elect to do.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Paul.
Um, I was wondering, right there, it looks like you left 2 buds. I was wondering if you shorten it up to 1 bud, would you increase the chance of a shoot pushing out of the cordon?
Not necessarily, and it's going to depend on how many shoots. Like if I do have other shoots that are coming out of here, and even if they're fruitless, I would maybe take this down to 1 just so I don't have overcrowding, and then just use this shoot to retrain. So I wouldn't think that you would get latent buds to break because you've cut down that spur. It's going to depend on what's causing the decline in productivity, if that makes sense. Like if you have trunk disease, it doesn't really matter how many buds I leave. I'm not necessarily going to get a sucker that grows out of that cordon. If I have a relatively healthy, somewhat youngish cordon, yeah, I might get several shoots to pop along here actually that I can then use to retrain. But if it's for fruit production, maybe I'll keep both of these and just keep 1 additional shoot still.
So it depends how old the cordon is with what you're starting. The
Yeah.
older that cordon gets, the less likely you're ever gonna see anything push out of it.
Yep.
So in the instance, let's say you had somebody who used poor pruning or even skipped pruning for a year, you might get a shoot coming out if you shorten it up.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe. But it's going to depend. Like we have some gnarly old cordons out in some of our vinifera and block B. You're never going to get a sucker out of that cordon. You're lucky if you get anything that's coming out of the base of the trunk that you could renew in general. And that's just going to be a function of cumulative damage when it comes to our vine age. So if we have, like for us, some of our vinifera that have gone through, I don't know how many cold injury events over the past decade. They maybe had a graft union exposed at some point. They ended up with vascular damage in their trunk and just cumulative damage over time, right? It's going to be harder and harder to recover from that as that vine continues to age. And so it's going to continue to throw fewer and fewer suckers over time as a result. And eventually, that's why our vinifera have a lifespan of about 25 years-ish before we have to begin to consider replacing the vine. Hybrids, it's a slightly different story, but again, goes back to, did you have any sort of trunk damage, crown gall, or other types of injuries that are going to decrease that vine age? Have there been, other factors that are contributing to the health of that vine and whether or not it will continue to produce suckers? Some will, some won't. And that's just, it's kind of like us when we age too, right? It's harder for me to get out of bed in the morning, that's for sure. And so, yeah, the further that vine gets into aging, the harder and harder it becomes to renew itself. And it's just going to depend on health and cumulative age and impacts. So, okay. That said, this is what that renewal actually looks like in some of our older vines. This was from Block B last year. One of the issues that we can come across with cordon pruning is the fact that we do have to make relatively large pruning cuts into older wood. Fortunately, you can see kind of a little bit in this photo that the cordon wood itself was actually pretty healthy, all things considered. We'd like to keep it that way. So we do know that fungal spores and other inoculum will colonize that wood surface as it's healing and can cause trunk disease, but typically it moves very slowly throughout the wood. So provided we're leaving ourselves enough grace in the cutting and stump size of that piece of wood, typically we won't have any problems downstream from that. So yeah, it can look really gnarly to cut off old wood and then replace it, but that's what we did with this vine here, and that's what happens when you have continuously lower cordon productivity over time. So we got lucky on this one, is what I should say, Paul. Okay. So when should we be pruning? Now is actually a pretty decent time if you haven't started, but we typically suggest on smaller vineyard acreage, start in the late winter to early spring. And there's a handful of reasons for that. The biggest one is that we're through the brunt of our winter cold temperatures, because the last thing we want to do is go through a polar vortex event, lose all of our buds, but whoops, we've already pruned and now we can't adjust. So delaying allows for that. And then ideally when we're dormant pruning, and this is where I put some asterisks to go into further detail, is to complete that dormant pruning by bud swell. So we have basically, here in Worcester, we tend to break bud at earliest around April 14th, April 15th. Last year we were on April 7th when we started breaking bud. That said, your site may vary based on where you're at. So if you're down south, you might be as early as mid-March. If you're up in Northeast, Northwest, you might be as late April. It's going to depend on how warm your site is. In order of pruning, and this is where I think it's pretty important to talk about this a little bit, because most of us are growing more than one cultivar. But I would tend to start with our most cold hardy and latest bud break varieties first. So something like Chamberson, I think is a great example of I would prune this vine first. If I have something that's cold hardy but early bud break, and my example is Marquette, because Marquette for us is one of the first to break bud, I'm going to push that off as late as humanly possible because I really want to stave off that bud break as late as humanly possible. So that's going to be my second priority. If I'm having something that's cold tender, but then late bud break, like Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon, well, I'm gonna prioritize that behind both my cold hardy varieties. But if I'm only growing Cabernet Franc and vinifera, well, then I'm gonna do that first, right? That makes sense. And then my last varieties that I would ever prune are gonna be cold tender but early bud break, and that would be like Chardonnay. And then you still can have a spectrum even within hybrids, right? Like Frontenac is mid, so maybe I'd prune in a hybrid vineyard, Chamberson, then Frontenac, then Marquette. So that's how I'd prioritize it for hybrids. You could say the same for vinifera. I'm going to prune my Cabernet Franc, then my Sauvignon Blanc, then my Chardonnay. So it can go either direction on that. Okay. So the reason why I put that asterisk there is because delayed or double pruning can help with frost protection, and it does because it can stave off bud break of the buds that you want to retain for your fruiting needs by about 7 to 10 days, depending on when you conduct this final pruning. So again, it takes advantage of this concept of apical dominance, where the top buds here, so this is all pictures of the same vine, by the way. So we left these canes last year very long. And what you'll see is that the buds are starting to break here up at the very top of this canopy. But down at the bottom, all these buds are still enclosed, and you can see how they're still dormant down at the base. So when I go through and I do my final pruning and I'm going to take off all of this right here, well, all these are still going to be closed for several more days while the top buds are starting to break. This can suppress the bud break of these, again, by about 1 to 1.5 weeks, and that could be all you need between a frost event and no frost event. So really it's a great avoidance or delay tactic, and that's why we also suggest typically to prune as late as possible. But it doesn't matter if these buds break because you're going to take them off anyway. So that's why it doesn't matter if they're starting to open up. That said, if you do use this as a tactic to delay bud break, you should do your final pruning no more than when these shoots are about open to 1 inch in length, because then you can start to run into some other issues when it comes to productivity and yield potential of these bottom buds. We have started noticing that. If you were to let these go, say 6 inches, 3 to 6 inches, you can start to see problems with the yield potential and having some fruitless bud break down at the bottom. So if you're going to use this, and we've had several smaller vineyards adopt this because wind machines are $65,000 plus just to install, you can use that as an option for avoiding frost.
Maria, quick question if I could. So in order to leverage the atypical dominance, you have to push the any pruning activities deeper into the spring. so that you can start to see the bud swell on the end of the canes, make that cut, and then come right back and do the final bud selection. There's no advantage to double pruning now and then coming back in a month or two.
There is, actually. So what I was going to say to that is, even if you were to take off half this canopy, as long as you have somewhere around like 8 to 10 buds, you can still use the same principle. We just happened to not prune these last year because they were like, 1, pressed for time, 2, we were 2 weeks ahead in the growing season. So everything was breaking way before we expected it. So it kind of became a good opportunity for us to delay pruning, because the other thing too is, in Worcester, our last date of frost is May 15th. And when you have bud break starting April 7th, you're talking about nearly a month and change of having to risk frost. And in fact, we did have a frost event on April, what was it, 22nd, 24th, something like that last spring. So yeah, it actually saved us pretty big time by delaying our pruning as long as humanly possible. And we're still able to get through, well, we have about 3 acres of grapes that we pruned last year within a month with just 1 person. So it is totally possible to do this on a relatively small scale. You just have to do it strategically and knowing what you're doing. But it turned out to be advantage for us. So what I have seen from some vineyards actually is they'll take mechanical pre-pruners, run through, take off the top half of their canopy, because that's actually the hardest, most time-consuming part to prune, is when you have to rip brush, right? So if you're able to remove that brush up front in, say, January, because that's when you can get a tractor in with a pre-pruner, or that's when you got some time and some labor availability that you're trying to keep employed between December and March. That's a perfect time to go through and rip that brush off. Just leave long spurs, or in some cases, I was talking to someone in Southeast yesterday who's actually just selecting their spur position and electing to leave that cane long, so that when they have to do their final pruning, all they have to do is chop down that cane to their 3-node spur, and that's it. So you can do a lot of strategic planning up front when you're doing pre-pruning to actually use this as a viable technique. And that's only because they're growing French American hybrids that they know are going to break super early, but their last date of freeze isn't until like May 1st. And by early, I mean they tend to break bud like 3rd week of March. So they have a long, long time, and the longer they can delay that, and even if they can get by with an extra 10 days, that's often all you need to avoid a frost event. It's a game of margins, really is what it is. But if you know how to do it and you know how you can do it competently for your vineyard, it can be a very effective strategy. So this is exactly what I mean by that. So this was our frost event back in April. I don't know if I have, okay. Back in late April of last year. So you can see all these buds broke up here, right? And we actually had a couple that did die. So this guy was toasted. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter, because when you look at the buds that we're actually going to retain, they're all down here at the base, 1 and 2, and they're both still enclosed. So we actually could keep a full crop on this vine just by having this longer spur. In part because if these die up here, we don't care. We were going to remove them anyway. So that's what I mean by this can be a really good tactic for avoiding freeze damage. And really, that's all we needed. Yeah, we did have risk of freeze for 2 more weeks, but it turned out we didn't have one. So, thank goodness. But yeah, for us in our smaller vineyard, this actually worked very well. Even if it was by accident that we ended up double pruning last year. So it does, and it can work. Okay. So going back to how much to remove, again, we're removing approximately 90% of the 1-year-old wood, and these are all 1-year-old, these canes that are all upright, right here. And we're gonna go ahead and remove 90% of it. So this is my schematic of what I would have removed along this vine. So get rid of a lot of this, and you have all your positions here. So there's one thing you'll notice about this is what I was trying to do is trying to keep these spurs as close to the cordon as I could possibly get. So I'm not selecting, again, and it's gonna vary, right? Sometimes you don't get a choice like this. You just gotta deal with what you're given. And in other cases like this right here, you get an option. So if you have a nice cane right here that you can use as a renewal position, well, I'm gonna elect to get rid of this existing spur here with these 2 canes. And that just makes a lot of sense. Again, trying to keep that fruit zone uniform and consistent right through here. Okay, So how do we determine the number of nodes or buds that we need to leave? It's going to be based on a concept called balanced pruning, which is going to vary based on your vine size. And by your vine size, it's really the pruning weight of the 1-year-old wood that's removed from the vine. And if you didn't know him, this is our former colleague, Ahmed Dami. He passed away in October, but was with our program for over 21 years. So I did want to pay tribute to him with this, because this is one of his favorite topics to talk about every year. But to get kind of the number of buds that you need to leave to have a balanced vine, we use what's called a pruning formula. Again, I'm very bad at arithmetic, but even I can do this. First, I guess I should add this as well, is that we've varied this based on what's called a crop load, and the crop load is going to be the ratio between your yield and pruning weight. This is completely irrelevant if your vines are not cropping. So if your vines are 1 to 3 years old and you're just getting them established, this does not matter to you. What matters is you take off those clusters, you provide enough vegetative growth that you can establish that vine, and then we start to worry about our crop. Given this is not a training presentation, it's a pruning workshop. This is for mature vines. So this is just some basic information to keep in mind. We want, for a balanced vine, to have what's called a Ravaz index, or this yield divided by pruning weight, to be between 5 and 10, and that's going to go for vinifera. If we're talking about hybrids, we can have values that are between 10 and 28, purely because they produce enough vegetative growth to be able to carry that crop every single year. If you're over 10, typically it's going to be overcropped, and you'll get that pale red unripe fruit like we saw up front. And if you're less than 5, your vines are undercropped, you probably will have very long, very aggressively growing shoots that you're going to have to hedge frequently. You might have to do more leaf removal on them. And it's also going to cause shaded fruit. That could decrease the quality of that fruit. And most importantly, you're losing revenue. So again, in a margins game, we don't want to have economic losses where we can avoid them. And this is one where we could avoid them. So again, just keep these numbers in mind, 5 to 10 and 10 to 28. And then this is the balanced pruning formula. So these are the number of buds to leave based on your per pound of pruning weight, your 1-year-old pruning weight. And it's going to vary between your grape types. So what you'll notice is modern hybrids, the Minnesota hybrids like Itasca, Marquette, Clarion, La Crescent, Frontenac, are all going to be on this 20+20 formula. And typically it doesn't require excess cluster thinning in season. And then the other one is vinifera, is also going to be 20+20, where you have 20 buds for your first pound of pruning weight, and then an additional 20 buds for each additional pound of pruning weight. Depending on the variety, you may need to cluster thin. So Cabernet Franc is a known overcropper. You want to remove a little bit of excess fruit on that vine so that you can balance out that vegetation. And then it'll also vary. So if you have seedless table grapes, it's going to be 30+10, 30 buds for your first pound of pruning weight, and then 10 additional buds for each subsequent pound of pruning weight. And same with American hybrids. Okay. So this is just an example of what that looks like. If I have 1 pound of 1-year-old wood, I'm going to leave about 20 buds per vine. If I have 2 pounds, that's 20+20, so I'm going to leave 40 buds. And then if I have 2.5 or somewhere in between, that's going to be 2+10, or 1/2 of 20, for 50 total buds per vine. So I've summed this up into like general rules of thumb, but broadly speaking, we want about 4 to 6 buds per foot of vine spacing. So if I have a 6 foot space vine, well, that's where this number times 6 comes from to get 36. 6 shoots per vine, 6 buds per vine, 6 buds per foot across 6 foot per vine gives us 36 buds per vine. There we go. And in some cases we want fewer, right? If we have a red overcropping variety like Cabernet Franc, well, we're going to leave 4 buds per foot instead of 6. And if we have hybrids, well, we're going to leave 6 buds per foot instead of 4. So this is effectively where we get 20 to 50 buds per vine. Now, if you accidentally leave 34, is anybody going to come up to you and say, tisk, tisk? No, it's not a big deal. And if you leave, say, I wanted to leave 30 and I left 50 or 60 buds per vine. Is that a problem? Yeah, it is. So I will come up to you and I will come on my vineyard visit and I will say, tisk, tisk, we need to thin this. So it's just, again, a roundabout number. And the more you prune, the more you understand what this number will actually look like, and what this spacing should look like as well. Okay, so back to spurs, and I should note that in most varieties, there is a difference between count and what we call non-count buds, and that is because a lot of varieties have these tiny, tiny little buds right here in the armpit that don't actually produce fruit. They're called non-count buds because they're vegetative. So when we're counting, what does it mean to have 36 buds per vine? We don't count these guys. We're counting from about 1/4 inch up at that piece of wood. And this is how we end up leaving 4 bud spurs, as we forget that this actual first count bud is maybe 1/4 inch above where the base of that spur is. So this is actually bud number 1 and bud number 2. And this itself is a 2 bud spur. Same here. We have bud number 1, bud number 2, and our non-count is right down here. So very important to understand that distinction. If you're growing varieties like French American hybrid, so Vidal Blanc, Saval Blanc, Chancellor, Chamberson, it is really common for these buds right here to actually be fruitful. And it is not unreasonable to consider this in, say, Deschenach, Marcel Foch, and those varieties to be a 3 bud spur. So those hybrids are incredibly prolific. It's also why we tend to cluster thin them, because if you get a latent bud like this, this is year 1, and it's really confusing. This is year 2. So you do actually have a bud right here. And Paul, when you're talking about latent bud break, this is kind of what we're hoping for, that this gets concealed under layers and layers of bark, and that eventually this may push for us if we want to renew that position. But this may actually break, who knows? And then the other thing we need to think about, so again, what is a count versus a non-count bud? And then how many buds per spur we're leaving, and also how many spurs in our foot of space are we leaving? So this to me is considered overcrowding, because if you look at this, you can see the potential of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 shoots off of the bat, right, that are pushing on 1-year-old wood. This was just we just didn't clean up that position. So this actually left a bud right here that then pushed. And this is why we care so hard about how many buds we're leaving, because on grapes, almost every bud is gonna break at some point or another, and we're gonna end up with 50,000 shoots if we don't prune properly. And all these 50,000 shoots are gonna have fruit on them, which means instead of having these nice long 2 to 3 foot shoots, we're gonna have like 6 to 12 inch shoots. And that's not gonna ripen our fruit. But in this case, we just have an egregiously like too many spurs in this one position, where in reality, we should cut this off and just retain this. But it's gonna also depend, and in the world of viticulture, everything depends on where our next spur position is. So if we have 8-10 inches of a gap on our cordon, well, maybe it makes sense to actually keep this number of buds in this one position. But if we have equally spaced spurs along our cordon, then we have too many spurs in one lump group. Okay, so, oh, there we go. I gotta remember where I put my animations. Okay. So back to this, yep.
You try to take that non-count spur off right away, or?
No.
No, just leave it.
Yeah, and again, it's gonna depend. I mean, if I know that I have another spur that's right here, spur that's right here, well, yeah, by all means, I'll just whack this off. It's not a big deal. If I know that I have like 8 to 10 inches, I'm just gonna wait to shoot thin and just to leave my 4 shoots in this one. Yeah. Okay. So talking about spur spacing, and I like this example that I had used earlier in this presentation purely because this has about as good of spur spacing as you're ever humanly going to possibly get. We want ideally, and it doesn't matter if you're a hybrid, vinifera, whatever, we want about 4 to 6 inches between our spurs. So I didn't wear my pruning t-shirt today, but I typically do. It's got all of my built-in measuring tools on it and everything. But this one is actually really easy. It's just the size of my fist. So I'll often just go through and make sure that I'm not leaving massive gaps by just using my fist and going like, okay, that looks about right. Because this is about 4 to 6 inches in between my fists. So that's really a great tool to use when you're talking about helping to develop that uniformity in spur positions. And that's exactly what these spur spacings tend to be, is about 4 to 6 inches. So this is a great example of very uniform spur spacing. Okay. I did want to add a caveat for anybody growing Concord, Labrusca, or other Labrusca varieties like Niagara, Catawba, Diamond, Marquis, whatever the case may be. In part because these are the exceptions to the rule of pruning and spur length and how many buds per spur you're actually leaving. And I say this because if you look at this graph for Concord, you end up with the highest crop weight in terms of cluster weight actually in the middle of a cane. So the spurs that are on Labrusca need to be about 5 to 6 buds per spur, purely because the bulk of your production is coming from these positions and not from 0 to 1 or on long canes that are more than about 6 buds. So Randy, if you were to cut down to 2 node spurs, you'd have to triple your spurs in terms of Concord to be able to get an equivalent amount of production as if you were to leave fewer or longer spurs. Okay, so I wanted to add that in. Yep. Not really. It's just purely cluster size. And in our climate, it's very challenging not to get Concord to at least 15 to 17 bricks. And with Niagara and some of the other white Labruscas, really we need to be aiming for about 12 bricks. So it's not a ripeness problem that's really going to be the issue. It's going to be a yield problem. So you'll be penalized by yield if you have very short spurs on those varieties. However, Terry Bates did the math for me, again, all about that. He said in order to attain an approximate yield on 5 bud spurs, you would need to leave 100 buds total on 2 bud spurs for Concord to get an equivalent yield. So that's just a ton of spurs. And that's the one exception to our buds per spur rule. Okay. So I need to wrap this up pretty quickly, but what to retain, wood quality matters a lot. We want, again, sun exposed, diseased free, uniform reddish brown color, about 4 to 8 inches in internode length, and that's gonna vary based on cultivar. And then the diameter of our wood matters a lot, and we want about 1/4 to 1/2 inch diameter wood. So this is perfect. This is beautiful, healthy, sun exposed, awesome wood. Almost all of it is within that 1/4 to 1/2 inch. We do have one exception, and it's some of this weak, I want to call it wimpy wood. I really want to call it a curse word, but weak junk wood like this is what we need to get rid of. And even this is actually quite weak. However, and Paul, this is where it goes back to your 1 bud per spur rule. If we are going to retain weak wood because of the position itself, we just go back to a single bud. We don't try to push 2 to 3 buds per shoot or per cane. Okay. So this is a good example of what that looks like. And there's a reason why I say this, right? So thank you to Randy up front who brought this behemoth. This is bullwood. It is huge. It is often oval in shape, and it is less cold hardy, and you get almost no fruit off of this because it's so vegetative, hence why it's like 6 feet long, 8 foot long. This thing is massive. So we don't want to keep this wood when we're pruning. We want to get rid of it. Instead, what we want to keep is this, and it's very counterintuitive. So this is really nice, healthy. It's about maybe 1/3 of an inch in diameter. It's, you got about 4, once again, my little fistful, about 6 inches in between each internode position. This is beautiful. This is what we want to keep. So, as I say, cut the bull crap. And get rid of this. This is really an excellent example, but man, that's a monster. But that is what we mean by bullwood. And then anything that's less than 1/4 inch in diameter doesn't really support strong shoot growth. So if you do elect to leave it because that's your only option, just leave 1 bud. Okay, so common pruning mistakes. Again, avoid weak wood writ large. Doesn't matter if it's really small, doesn't matter if it's really big. Think pencil or Sharpie. I prefer Sharpie. It's just a little bit fatter, but honestly, pencil to Sharpie is about the equivalent of what we want. So we should all be carrying those in our pockets anyway. If you have any doubt, just, yeah, break it out. Okay, that's it. Going back to my example. That's about what you want. So, keep that in mind. And then what happens when you're training a vine and you have very weak growth in year one? This is super common, right? Whether you plant that vine late, you had some weed competition with it, maybe it was a drought year like last year. What do? You start again. The only impetus behind our year one is to get that root system established, and then we can start to worry about the development of that trunk and vine architecture. Don't push what doesn't need to be pushed. Take care of it instead. So effectively what we would suggest is you cut back to just 2 to 4 buds per vine. Again, it looks terrifying because you're like, that's nothing. If I lose a shoot, then what? Well, you'll get some secondary bud break or you'll get something else, but just cut it back to 2 to 4 buds per cane and then just let it regrow. Okay. Some folks ask, can you train lateral canes? So lateral canes are anything that arise off of the main shoot during the growing season. They lignify, become woody, and I'll use this example because they exist. So stuff like this, right? This is our main shoot that came out of the vine. Hey Ben, do I need to? Anyways. Sorry, I talk a lot. So these were lateral shoots during last growing season. They came out of a lateral node here and developed. Can you actually use these to train during pruning? The short answer is yes, you can, but if and only if they're actual quality pieces of wood. So in this case, this is actually Texas, so I don't ever really see this in Ohio. In Texas, where it's hot and a long season, yeah, you absolutely can get lateral shoots that can then be used to train. Typically, though, I don't recommend it because those lateral canes tend to be relatively weak and are shoots that grow here in Ohio. This is actually more akin to what I normally see. So when we get a situation like this and you want to train that lateral cane, sometimes you can, even if it's just a little bit, but then you need to cut it off here, because anything beyond this point is going to be weak and less than 1/4 inch in diameter and not productive. So make sure to cut this out and then cut out any other weak cane that happens to come off of this vine as well. And that'll get you off under the right path in the next year. Okay. Next, good pruning skills reduce trunk infections. This also can't be overstated enough. 1, never prune in the rain because rain is going to disperse fungal spores that are going to infect that wood. 2, use clean, sharp tools. That's going to help make a nice flush cut that you can then heal over, the vine can heal over really well. And then lastly, leave stumps that are about twice as long as the diameter of the wood. So yeah, we would love to have beautiful, clean, flush looking wood, but unfortunately that wood tends to get infected because it doesn't heal fast enough before it actually does get infected. And once this infection reaches your main permanent arms, whether that be your cordons or your trunks, that's what often leads to our decline in productivity. So the goal should have been leave a little bit more stub. That stub will die back over the next year, in which case you can then go and flush cut that back to the cordon. But leaving an open and exposed wound like this is like saying I'm going to take off my leg and not provide a tourniquet. So I don't want to go septic, and neither does this vine. Okay, so this is what I meant by cordons do decline in productivity over time. I'd also like to note this is it's okay, it happens. Old cordons happen. But this vine in particular, you'll notice some black along these spurs here. This vine had a ton of phomopsis in the previous year, and that's what we mean by having disease-free wood or disease that can go on to infect larger pieces of tissue. So again, when you have damage that looks like this, if you can, if possible, replace this cordon. In some cases, you know, if your cordon is quite low, like 2 feet from the ground, oftentimes you can just retrain a whole new trunk that can then be used to replace that cordon within the same year. Okay, and then efficiently fill your trellis space. So we're talking about lost revenue. This is where you can make up for it. So unfilled trellis loses you yield and loses you revenue because now all of a sudden you're not actually, so you can see this is where the head of the vine is. It's about probably 1.5 feet in space, maybe 2 feet. So by shortening that up and then training your trunks more straight, you can effectively fill in this gap with fruit and almost increase your productivity by about 25% per vine and averaged across the rest of the vineyard. That's a lot of yield. So making sure that we're using that space efficiently goes a long ways towards that revenue. Okay. And then lastly, I know for us vinifera growers, we love to get that vine established, production, and yielding as soon as possible because that's also quite a bit of money. However, by doing so, we can often actually lose out on cordon establishment in part because we went too far too fast. So this is an example of that, well, it was pre-pruned, but of laying down a cordon in 2 sections. So the first year was about 15 to 18 inches in length. And then we have a bud strategically very positioned, pointing outwards, that we're going to then use to train our next 12 to 15 inches of cordon length, or however long that space actually happens to be. This is less practical for hybrids that tend to break along every position, but in vinifera that don't, we end up with a lot of missing gaps within that cordon if we don't train it to have every single bud break. And this is where it's like, I was joking about my pruning t-shirt, but it actually has a cane that's along it that's 15 inches that I can then go and use. But if it's effectively the distance between my fist and my elbow. So if I'm out in the vineyard and I don't know what 12 to 15 inches is, I'm going to use this distance to actually measure that out. And then improper tying can girdle your wood. I don't love chain ties. I know they're really cheap, accessible, and easy to use, but you do have to be careful with them because if you don't remove them, at some point you do end up girdling that wood. Girdled wood is obviously going to die because you're cutting off access to that vascular tissue development and that vascular cambium. So that can be very problematic, and this is what leaving a chain tie on forever tends to do, as that wood does expand over time. So just being cognizant of what ties you're using, how often you need to take them off and remove them, or what you need to do. So here are just a handful of tying alternatives. We use for young vines, especially flexible vinyl tape that can break off pretty easily. But rubber T-bands, especially if you're training, these are also a natural product that will dry out and break off over time. Flexible tube ties, some of these have metal wires in them that are meant to break down and break off. Others of them you do have to be careful, kind of like the chain ties, and make sure that you're removing them because if they're plastic or rubber throughout, they might not necessarily break apart. You can talk to your vendor of choice for these. The 2 vendors that I tend to recommend are Mike Schreiber at Fred's Water Service and Spec Trellising out of the Finger Lakes. Of course, there's Orchard Valley Supplies and others depending on who you tend to work with, but almost all of them carry similar stuff. You can also get some of these products through Gempler's, AM Leonard, or other online vendors as well. So, number of options available. And then I think this is the last one I have. Vineyard sanitation is key. If you have disease in any given year, that disease tends to persist, especially for Phomopsis, Anthracnose, and black rot. So this is an example of black rot on a cluster at harvest. These are pretty much all of your inoculum for the next year. And if you haven't seen these guys persist over winter in a canopy, they will be there forever if you let them. So ideally, we need to be taking these off, removing them, and ditching them. So this is black rot. This is what Phomopsis looks like in overwintering wood as well. It infects young green tissue early in the growing season, and then will overwinter and persist in that wood. And then this is an example of a gall maker. It's a small midge insect that will lay its eggs in the shoot during the growing season, and then those eggs will hatch the following year, but we can easily prune out these galls. So when people call and they say, oh, well, I have a gall problem, should I spray? I say, no, you should actually prune it out. Vineyard sanitation is key for that. I think I kept my little meme in here from last year, but yes, burn it all. So make sure that you're getting it out and you're destroying it. However that means. You can burn it in a pile. You can compost it, but that compost needs to be above 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Or you can mulch it if your wood is clean, using a flail mower or some other sort of chipper within your vineyard row to compost it back in. So those are your options, but as Elmo says, fire! Okay. So that was it for common pruning mistakes. We'll go out and see our own mistakes out at Hort 2 later. And then adjusting for winter injury is the last section I had for today. Whoops, that's going backwards. Okay. So this was our cold event from January 22nd. You can see a pretty wide range of temperatures. Y'all down here, Southeast Appalachia and the hollers, only got to about -3. If you're in kind of the the areas of South Central, this area of Piketon tends to be very cold. That area got as cold as about -14 out in Clark County. And then actually up here in Youngstown tends to be a cold area in Mansfield. So these 3 areas along 71 in the hills and higher elevations tend to get very cold. Us in Wooster at Hort 2, we hit about -9, but in our colder station hit as cold as -14. And then even up in the Ashtabula County area, they hit anywhere between about -6 to about -10. So we were all in that same very cold boat. It just depended on where you were located. But there are ways that we can deal with it. And I will show you some of our data on the bud injury and how we would plan to adjust this year, which thankfully isn't as bad as I expected. Considering that most vinifera only survived to about -5 to -10, it's amazing we didn't just get blown out of the water. But when it comes to assessing cold or bud injury and cold injury, you want to take about 50 to 100 buds per variety or vineyard block if you happen to have a lot of topographical variation. The top of the hill is going to be very different temperature-wise in these types of events compared to the bottom of the hill because cold air settles in radiative events, meaning we have no wind movement and we have basically drainage based on elevation and topography. And these localized cold spots can be easily 2 to 3 degrees colder than where you are at the top of the hill. And because of that, you can actually see a range and variability between your bud injury, even within the same site. So be conscious of that when you're taking samples. Make sure they're representative. So don't just take really crappy wood. Take good wood throughout the block and not just from one vine. Take across multiple vines. And then for that 50 buds, we suggest 5 to 10 canes with about 10 nodes per cane. And that's because you're going to get the range of injury. So if you're cane pruning, you know about how much you're losing. If you're spur pruning, you know about how much you're losing. To me, it does not make sense to take 20 plus bud counts because you're not leaving 20 plus buds per cane. So 10 nodes is really all you really need. And so taking those sometime when we're closer to 32 degrees, not when we're still at like -10, but letting them come up to room temperature for about 24 to 48 hours. What's gonna be dead is dead. And then you can go through and section these buds by taking a sharp razor blade and almost perpendicular to the face of the bud, cutting out about 1/3 at the top to expose the actual buds underneath the protective outer coatings of the bud scales. We'll showcase that. So ideally what we want to see is everything green is alive, it's great, looking wonderful. But we certainly have buds that do die, and when they die, it's typically the primary bud. So the primary bud is the biggest bud of this compound bud. It's the one that produces the most fruit, it's the one that we want to keep, and it's the one we want to prioritize, but it's also the most sensitive among all 3 buds. So this guy here is what it looks like when it's dead. It's brown. That makes sense. Brown tissue die, or when green tissue dies in plants, it turns brown. So this is what it looks like on the interior transverse section of that same cane, where everything is green and healthy, but on vines that have experienced very severe winter injury and vascular tissue, when you section that vascular tissue, oftentimes it will be brown and streaky. And this is what contributes to when you see a vine in the middle of June and it all of a sudden just dies spontaneously. You're like, whoa, what happened? 99% of the time it's some form of vascular related injury because that vine can now no longer transport water and nutrients from the soil to support itself, and so it collapses. Okay. So here are some of our bud injury rates from this year. Some of these are very cold hardy, some of these are less cold hardy, but what we saw is a range. So our most cold hardy stuff, Frontenac Blanc, that thing can take a beating to -40 and keep on licking, which is why we keep planting it. So very little injury among those, and then Crimson Pearl is also a cold hardy new Tom Plocker private breeder hybrid out of Minnesota. But what you'll see is that even some of our Minnesota hybrids and Cornell hybrids did have fairly extensive injury to them. I'll get there in a moment. It's in that 2024 review if you got a copy. And then, of course, in our vinifera, we have Cabernet Franc, about 10%, not too bad. Regent, about 13%. And then Primitivo, I laugh at it because if you know wine, Primitivo is Italian Zinfandel. Needless to say, well, I thought it was gonna like 100% die and it didn't. So I'm actually pretty shocked myself that we only saw about 62% overall injury. So could have been worse. Still wouldn't expect a big yield out of it, but also it's not totally dead. And then up in Ashtabula, their vinifera saw largely about 2 to 10% injury, and it depends. Sauvignon Blanc is also quite sensitive, like Primitivo, but not quite as bad. Saw about 13% injury. So overall, I'm going to quote Todd Steiner, we're sitting pretty good. So these are just some recommended adjustments for bud retention if you happen to have sustained injury. So if you have less than 15% bud injury, do nothing. And that's what we're going to do for the most part this year, is nothing. I did say, okay, so 15 to 34%, leave about 35% more bud. So if you know you're leaving 36 buds per vine, times that by 0.35 and add it to your total. And I did say I was going to talk about this briefly, which we had 20 to 31% injury in these varieties, and I believe it's purely because we had herbicide drift injury last year. If you've ever had herbicide drift injury, not only is it a pain in the tuchus because you tend to lose a lot of your yield, but also it turns out it can substantially weaken your vines as well. And whether or not these buds actually died as a direct result of that injury, or if they died in the cold incident itself because they were less cold hardy, I don't 100% know because we didn't dissect until after that cold event. But needless to say, 20 to 31% injury in a cold hardy hybrid where we're seeing 10%, 11% in Cabernet Franc is telling me that there's something else going on that was not just purely related to that cold incident. That said, okay, 35 to 50%, double the number of buds. So if you're supposed to leave 36 times 2. And if you have 51 to 75%, minimally prune your vines. And Diane packed up our example today. This is what minimally pruning actually looks like. So when we're talking about pre-pruning, you can do this with just slightly longer canes, right? That's what this looks like. Now, that means you're going to have a ton of shoot thinning to do, but would you rather have to do shoot thinning or have no yield? That is always the question. So you guys can come check that out during our demo. But that's what a hedge prune vine looks like. I believe that was because the vine died, and so they just took it out of the ground and shellacked it after the 2014-2015 polar vortex event. And then if you're greater than 75%, just call it a total loss. You're basically going to retrain from the ground up, whether that be from if you're own rooted from the root system or if you're grafted from just above the graft union, but expect to basically have vascular damage and replace that vine. So if we're talking about adjustments, the way to do it is you don't necessarily increase the number of buds per spur. You don't want to have 15 buds on your spur. What you would rather have is 6 buds with 2 to 3 bud spurs that are going to give you that increase in bud count. And that is because when you actually look at where damage occurs, damage is largely occurring out here on these further out nodes. So if we have, once again, our cane example here, most of these are actually going to be alive down at the bottom of the cane, whereas most of these are going to be dead. So if you're electing to leave really long canes, does it really matter if these aren't going to produce fruit anyway? The answer is no, they don't. So I'd rather see 4 of these down here than 1 of these, if that makes sense. Okay. So, and this is just taken from across a sample of bud injury when we had a polar vortex back in 2019. But basically what Diane found was that when she did her dissections, we had limited bud injury down here, but extensive bud injury down at the end of the cane. So this is your cane, alive, dead. When I say shoot thinning is required after minimal pruning, this is why. This is about as crazy and congested as you will ever see on a minimally pruned vine. And this is why pruning, once again, is so very important, but so is in-season canopy management. Making sure that we've taken this and condensed it down to our living, fruit productive, happy 36 total vine or shoots per vine is ultimately what we want. And I'm not gonna lie, we waited a little too long to shoot thin these, but this is what it can look like if you take that and you just let it grow. Okay, so that's all I got for presentation wise. Does anybody on Zoom have any questions? Yes, no, if not, we certainly appreciate you joining us via Zoom. And again, this presentation will be recorded or is recorded. So it should be coming to your inbox sometime in the next couple of days. Okay. So thank you guys on Zoom. You can also email me if you have any questions.
Is there anything in chat?
Thanks, Maria. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you.